VH1 to 1.
So, David, here we are. You're back with Brian Eno again. How did you two get together after the long break?
Shotgun wedding. 92. Brian and Anthea came to see my wife and I get married. And I'd written music for the church and for the party afterwards. And at the time, it was just instrumental. And Brian liked some of the things that I'd been doing in the music. I was sort of taking the saxophone and distressing it and sort of using electronic things on it to sort of either enhance it or break it down as a sound. And the format was vaguely dub. And I think Brian sort of liked the juxtaposition of things that I was doing. And it got us talking about state of music and all that, and possibly where it could go, and other interesting avenues that could be taken.
Had you actually had much contact with him in the intervening, what would have been, 13 years, 12, 13
No,
years?
virtually nothing. And the strange thing about Brian and my relationship is that when we do sort of meet again, we pick up virtually as though that no time has passed at all. I mean, chatted a little bit about what we'd done in the last intervening 10 years.
Yeah.
But it was sort of back to business, you know, immediately.
How do you two actually work together? I mean, when you came to make this album, who does what?
One thing that's always fascinated me talking to artists that Brian works with is, what is it that Brian does? Well, I don't quite know, but it really works well. So I try to identify it, and I think it has more to do with the fact that he brings his innate sense of context into a studio. And he can contextualize something in such a different way from anybody else that I've ever worked with.
What do you mean by contextualize?
Well, okay, he can look at a whole mass of work that to the artist and cohorts is very confused and doesn't seem to have a central voice of any kind. And he will use his philosophical framing device and say, that bit there is really good. Get rid of all the rest. And he will refine and hone things down and home in on something that's truly important about the work that one's doing. And then he's also very good at what-ifing. And he'll set up, what if the guitar player got on the drums for this track? What if we didn't have any bass on this track whatsoever? What would happen, I wonder? Those sorts of situations. But he's continually full of them. He never dries.
So you write the songs and you bring them in?
Well, I'm not sure if I write the songs anymore. Its authorship is in question. It really is the 90s. A lot of what we've put out on the Outside album, in fact, were improvisations that were put together by all of us. And indeed, I've credited, even down to the drummer, by virtue of the fact that he was in the room when we actually wrote these things. It seemed rather unfair to exclude him from writing credit, and indeed his royalty. So I sort of just saw it more as a workshop situation in those particular cases, that everybody contributed to it. I guess lyrically, I still sort of, yes, they're mine. Well, they're mine and Macintosh's. There could be a dispute raised that, yes, Apple might make claims on royalties. I shouldn't have said that.
So how different then was it making this album from the 3 albums that you made with Brian before? I mean, this new album has been described as on one of the releases as a return to the scenes of your greatest artistic triumphs back then.
I think probably the great difference is that at that particular period, we alternated performance. Brian would go and work for a couple of hours. Brian is he takes quite a long time when he works, say, with the synthesizer or whatever, and he would take long stretches in the studio, 3 or 4 hours at a time, and then he would go and get some rest, and I would go in and screw up everything he'd done and put my own spin on what he was doing. Then I'd leave and he'd come back and correct everything. And it sort of worked in that kind of...
like by negotiation?
Yes, it was by negotiation. And we arrived at a final piece of work by tacit agreement that we'd sort of gone far enough.
Trying to recapture some of the spirit and some of the sound of, say, the Low album or the Heroes album.
I think there were definite aspects of what we did back then that I think unconsciously we gravitated back toward, like the drum sound. But I think other than that, no, I think it was working pretty much on a blank canvas. And it was about not going in with pre-created songs, no songs. A collection of ideas in terms of lyrics or subject matter, as ephemeral and as diverse as possible. And taking in musicians who would be quite willing to break down their own inhibitions about what they could and couldn't do in a studio.
I was reading somewhere that somebody has, not you, has described this album as you getting back to your roots. I think possibly referring to the fact that you're using personae, characters again, that this album is a series of songs sung in character.
Getting back to my roots. Stackhill boots to the fore. No eyebrows. I'd hate that.
But singing in character, David, that obviously is something that is a constant.
I think probably, yes, that's right. I haven't done roles since probably '76 was the last out-and-out role. But I mean, the necessity for roles was dictated by the format that we found that we'd fallen into. The card that Brian gave me when we started recording said that I was a griot or a soothsayer or troubadour in a society where all networks are broken down. So I had to sort of explain the news and events to the people of my neighbourhood. So that's what I was. He gave all musicians, I mean, to another one, I think probably Reeves, he said, you are the disgruntled ex-member of a South African rock band. Play all the notes that were denied you. And things like that. So everybody came into the improvisations from a peculiar perspective. So the one thing that we did know is that they wouldn't all revert to the blues, because what happens when you put 6 or 7 musicians together is they find common ground, and inevitably it's in E, and it becomes blues, and it just goes on relentlessly for hour after hour. So we weren't going to have any of that.
Where did you derive the characters that you've used in the various songs?
They started coming through from all kinds of different places. I brought in my interests of the moment, which were ritual body art, neo-paganism, the Minotaur, I guess past references to things like diamond dogs and apocryphal, apocalyptic societies. The idea of the angst and anxiety caused by the rush toward the end of the millennium. All those things and more. And I typed it all into my computer, and I have a program in it that was developed for me by my friend Ty in San Francisco, which was a randomizing program. Very much, it's sort of an electronic simile of the way that William Burroughs works. And so, which is a method that I've employed for, God, years, since the early 70s again.
Which you used to do by hand?
By hand. In the old days, we had to do it by manual labour.
So well, this is like cutting up lyrics and then redistributing them?
Exactly. And so you get some highly interesting juxtapositions. Again, it does depend on what the input is. I mean, if the input isn't very interesting, you're not going to get very interesting cut-ups. And it's merely a tool. It doesn't mean that I was stuck with them. So sometimes I would have 3 and 4 line groups that would come straight from the computer that I would use in lyric form. At other times, there were 2 or 3 sentences that merely sparked an idea, and then I would write those up, those ideas that came from the juxtaposition. So, I mean, it's impossible to do. I suppose just for an exercise, you could develop a rule and say, I will only do what the computer says. And that would be kind of interesting. Maybe it's something we could do in the future. But for this particular project, we didn't have any of those kinds of rules. Do
you have any sense, David, of who your audience now is? I mean, I sense that in a way that you're slightly fleeing from the mass acceptance that you achieved in the early 80s.
Yes, I have been. Yes. I think probably it's a grumpy old postmodernist who lives probably in Notting Hill. That's my audience. I don't know. But I listen to the album and I think, God, I wonder who on earth this is going to appeal to. I'm really not sure. I don't know. I know I have a kind of a core audience who are big enough to kind of go with whatever I'm doing, and at least they'll have a look at it and decide if they need it or don't need it in their lives. And I guess others would take their cue from them, maybe. We'll see.
Now, how important is success to you at this point? I mean...
What kind of success?
Well, commercial success.
Well, I'd like to pay for the making of the albums.
Were they very expensive?
Well, we have done a lot of work. I mean, I think we've probably committed to about 4 or 5 different projects, outside merely being one of them. But as long as that's covered, I'm fairly up for whatever happens. I have no choice. In terms of, is it already a success? I would say so. Artistically, it's, for me, I think it's a tremendous success.
You're obviously building a lot of bridges between your musical interests and your interests in fine art.
Yes,
with this album,
I am.
and probably trying to reach a fine art audience with this album.
That's interesting.
I mean, here we are
I'm not sure
surrounded
about
by
that. Yes, I know. Yeah.
artworks.
Yeah. Oh, these?
They just happen to be
They
here.
just happen to be here.
They came up with room service, right?
This chain of hotels, in fact, have commissioned me to develop these things for all their hotels from here to
Right.
Singapore.
Oh, hypercycles within hypercycles.
We had some censorship in Singapore, but fortunately most other cities have been quite... I hadn't really thought about it in terms of being a vehicle for a fine art audience. I don't know. Don't know about that. I don't think so. But definitely among my friends and acquaintances who are involved in other art forms, there really does seem to be a movement towards going from one form to another. I'm definitely excited about the idea of artists working in different mediums. Most of the people that I knock about with or know and whatever and work with and do that. Eno himself works not only in music, he works in video installation. Damien Hirst is now making videos and doing TV spots for German television. Julian Schnabel, the painter, has just become a filmmaker with his Basquiat movie. It seems more and more the idea of having walls between the arts is a thing of the past. Quite rightly, I think its time has come. And I find it very exciting. I think it could yet again redefine what in fact is the nature of art and what art is for and how it's accomplished, and less emphasis on craft and technique.
Has the making of this album been a happier experience for you than the making of the trilogy of albums that you made with Brian Eno in the 70s?
Personally, probably. I mean, personally, I'm in a sort of a real stereotypical, rather happy, middle-aged domestic contentment state, still with a rabidly eccentric curiosity in what makes the world go round. But I think back then I was still the Egon Schiller type boy with angst. And I think I'm just a whole lot more buoyant now than I ever was.
VH1 to 1.